Well, welcome back to the show. We're talking about the international controversy over a travel ban issued by US President Donald Trump, issued late Friday. With me here in the studio is Lester Munson, Kamran Bokhari, and Yasmeen Alamiri. Let's get back to our discussion. Kamran, if President Trump is really serious about fighting terrorism, why aren't countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Qatar on this list? Because if we look at the 7 nations that are named on the list there, no national from any of those nations has ever carried out an attack on U.S. soil from those countries.
I mean, that is a valid charge, yeah. And it's a reasonable critique. I suspect the easy answer to that is that you can't just ban everybody and then hope to fight terror.
Right.
You know, because you have to have certain allies. What is the exact reasoning why a country like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan have not been included in this? I'm not aware of that, but it does seem to me that this is not a final list. There may be additions.
There are indications that he will expand that list. Yeah.
There may be additions to expand that. I doubt that Saudi Arabia will be put on that list, because if it is, then it makes the job of working in the Middle East, fighting terror, and expecting Saudi cooperation is going to be very difficult. Same thing with Pakistan, but Pakistan is more related to Afghanistan, and that's sort of an old, stale war that perhaps the administration can afford to annoy the Pakistanis. But I have doubts that it'll happen to the Saudis. Lester,
what thoughts do you have on this being a more comprehensive, more wider fight against terrorism?
Well, it's a good question, and I think the administration will point out that these 7 countries actually were listed during the Obama administration as being countries of concern. I think it would be good to go beyond that kind of talking point and say, well, what is it about these countries that made them a country of concern? Do we have some intelligence? Do we have some other information that would indicate there's a specific threat coming from those countries? And stepping even further back, I think it's only fair to point out that the driving force for this ban is the civil war in Syria, where you've got massive refugee flows out of that country, 500,000, up to 500,000 people who've been killed over the last 6 years. And that at its heart, this refugee crisis, of which this policy is meant to be a response, really originates in the failure of the West, and the United States in particular, to deal with the Syrian civil war in any kind of way that mitigated damage. In many ways, our actions or lack of actions maximize the damage from that civil war internationally. And so I think when we go back and look at these questions of refugees and whether we're taking them in, we also have to look at Syria policy and ask this administration, what are you going to do differently than the last administration to address the real root cause of this crisis?
So you're saying there are 2 purposes behind what the president has done here. One is to prevent, discourage, or actually stop refugees from Syria coming to the United States, and the other is fighting terrorism.
I think that's fair, but I think, but again, how do you really stop the refugee flow? You can't. We can build walls and ban people from coming here. You can build a wall with Mexico. People will still find a way to get into the United States. There are planes and boats and ways of getting here that are, we're not going to be able to stop all of them. So building Fortress America is not the ultimate answer. The ultimate answer is an international response to the crisis in Syria that's going to deal with the refugee problem so that Syrian refugees, frankly, can go home to where they want to be, which is in their own country.
I think it's also important to note that with the same token, the United States needs to also, and I've been hearing this from many people in my reporting, the United States also needs to be cautious about how this is received in the other Muslim majority nations or countries in the region, because it's not just about the countries, those 7 countries listed, and what this means for them, but it's also about the response that Saudi Arabia has come out, other countries have come out and said that they don't look kindly onto this, even though they weren't named.
That's a great point you raised there. You've covered the Middle East. What kind of impact is this kind of executive order and the way it's being implemented going to have in places like Iraq, like Syria?
I mean, for starters, I think it really will either harm or dissuade or actually eliminate the option of journalists and other people or aid workers going over to those countries to actually do good in those countries. And often when I'm in the Middle East and I'm covering a story, I rely heavily on a collaboration with those types of people who have been on the ground and doing the work and working hand in hand with the locals in the countries, in my case, in Iraq. And so I think inability of those types of people to be in the country is detrimental to both us as reporters to be able to work with them, and also the welfare and the well-being of the people that are in those countries, Iraqis, Syrians, who are in desperate need of help. So I think that both there's a diplomatic issue and there's a PR, some can say nightmare, that we have on our hands, but there's also the inability for people to move freely in and out of that country for good. It's not only for cynical reasons that people filter in and out of these Middle Eastern nations.
I've got to ask you this, as an Iraqi American, you're now in Washington, inside the United States. If you want to travel, say you want to go out of the country on vacation or visit someone in another country, are you having second thoughts about that?
Sure. I mean, on a very personal note, I'm planning to take my honeymoon in a week, and so I'm worried. I mean, I'm a U.S. citizen, but I also think that there are always second thoughts that you think, should I do this? Because like I said, there are lawyer friends of mine that said you really should just use an abundance of caution and stay home. And stay home being the U.S. That's home for me. And I think twice about it. Of course, I will go forward with my plans, and I think it'll all be fine. But it's also about having family come visit here. That's not a thing that we can consider anymore, unfortunately.
Well, congratulations, and I'm sure it'll all be fine.
Thank you, an interesting time.
And Kamran, that brings us to another question, more of a philosophical question about what is happening here in the United States. What does this do to U.S. standing in the world?
I mean, there is the perception, and then there is the reality. The perception is obviously hurt, and severely. Public opinion about the United States goes down at a time when we need allies to win the war on terror or to make progress on it. This doesn't help. I mean, this sort of really says that the United States, I mean, in many ways, it actually feeds the narrative of ISIS. That there is this war on Islam and Muslims that the U.S. is leading, and it becomes harder to fight that on the grassroots level in many of these countries. So there is that perception. But in reality, I just don't see any country really putting up a whole lot of resistance. Yeah. I mean, most likely because they can't.
Well, the resistance is coming from inside the United States. And as Jessica reported at the beginning of the show, we have something that we've never heard of before, the State Department issuing a statement saying we don't agree with the president because this is, as you pointed out, going to be counterproductive.
Of course, and I think that is sort of the challenge of the administration. I don't think that the administration is worried about the world, right? Because yes, there is public statements and rhetoric coming from leaders, but the Saudi king just spoke to Trump yesterday, and we already know that General Michael Flynn has a special relationship with the Turkish government. Right. The Pakistanis, I know from my own sources, are trying to court this administration as well. Everybody wants a piece of the action. The resistance and what will make a difference and whether there will be behavioral change and to what extent will depend on how it plays out inside the United States. Will Congress really put up stiff resistance? Will these protests continue? Will President Trump find it very difficult to govern on a day-to-day basis? Yeah. And that's sort of what's going to determine any change in the behavior.
Right, and Lester, the other bit of news that took place this afternoon was President Obama actually issued a statement criticizing President Trump. This is unprecedented, where you have a president who's just been out of office for less than 2 weeks telling the president who's there right now that he doesn't agree with him. Yeah,
I'm not sure that's helpful to the other side of this issue, frankly. I think it's better if the former president allows the current president to kind of carry out his agenda that he got elected on. Not to say that he has to agree with it. I think he has to give him the space to do it. George W. Bush gave President Obama that space for 8 years, really, and rarely said anything crosswise with the president. And I think President Trump has a huge opportunity here that I think that he's not seeing, and that's the real shame of this. He got elected on with really tough rhetoric, tougher than a lot of us had ever seen before. He's got a real opportunity here to demonstrate that he means what he says when he says we're not at war with Islam, that this is not racist, this is not bigoted. Do something along the lines of what George W. Bush did. Go to a mosque, meet with Muslims, get in touch with the people, show how big you are. Show your real strength, which is that you can be the president for everyone while still having a tough policy. And I'm not saying the U.S. shouldn't have a tougher policy on these immigration questions. It can be better managed, and he can have better messaging that's more presidential and less kind of campaign combative.
And I think that's the point, because when you say you're protecting American and American lives, Americans come in all different shapes and sizes and religions and creeds. And so I think when you speak to protecting the American public, it's in so many ways.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us.